Today is April 8th, 2020. Tonight at sunset, our Jewish siblings will be celebrating the festival of the Passover, Pesach. This is the remembrance of the 10th and final plague that God set on Egypt to prepare Israel for their journey to the promised land. It's an evening of food, family, and reminders of God's power and God's grace. You recall the story, don't you? God has visited 9 other plagues on Egypt as a way of showing Pharaoh who God was in the face of Egypt's idolatry. During this plague, the people of Israel were commanded to make a sacrifice and take the blood of that sacrifice and put it over the doorposts of their houses. Then they were told to go inside and distance themselves, separate themselves from the Egyptians and their idolatrous ways. I know that it's easy for us to see the parallels between this story and what we are going through right now. But please hear me when I tell you that I do not believe that God sent COVID-19 as any form of plague or judgment on our world. I know that there are many people out there who are going to think that way and try and find some way to find God's hand in this. But that is simply irresponsible. God's hand is in the helping and the healing. I know that many will want to capitalize on this and give people the thought that they somehow have an inside scoop into God's mind and God's ways. But I remind myself every day that God's ways are not my ways. And while I may want to blame someone in my humanness for this disease, that is not God's mode of operation in this day. We should not pretend to know the mind of God. How arrogant of us. But that's not the point of my teaching. What I want to talk about is what happened inside those homes. Well, I'm sure that there was fear, questioning, concern, sadness, anticipation, hope, and yes, maybe even some anger. I know that there was also something else: eating. God tells the people to eat this meal in haste, making themselves ready to go at a moment's notice. God told them to eat it with their cloaks on and their staff in their hand because their deliverance was near. With those kinds of instructions, it can be easy to see Israel preparing itself for something great, something they couldn't even imagine. Over the centuries, the meal from this evening has been adapted to include ceremonial foods that symbolize bitterness and tears, hope and grace. The word chesed in Hebrew. The meal has grown to include 4 cups of wine, each with its own meaning and remembrance. It is a meal for the whole family to gather together. It is a time to be one. In our tradition, it was the context of this meal that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. It was on the night he shared the symbolism of bread and wine, redemption and sanctification with his disciples. He gave that to us as an eternal reminder of the feast we will all share in the world to come. Our practice of Holy Communion is simply a mini Passover that we celebrate when we gather together. One of the things that I truly admire about the Jewish tradition is their understanding that worship does not always happen in the places of worship. Worship happens in our homes. Worship happens in the outdoors. Worship happens any place where we seek and find God. You see, Passover isn't a holiday meal where the family just gathers together and eats. It's a worship service. It's a time when the Jewish people intentionally draw their hearts to the miracles and the grace of God. Kavanah is a Hebrew word that talks about the intention we have in our hearts and minds to know the God who every day delivers us and brings us to a land flowing with milk and honey. This admiration for the Jewish tradition of worship happening in the home is something that I share with Martin Luther. As many of you know, I've had my share of disagreements with Dr. Luther, but in this we stand united. Martin Luther was also very appreciative of the Jewish tradition of teaching that the dinner table was an altar of sorts, a place where we sacrifice our time in study and our hearts in worship. The dinner table was the place where the family gathered and found ways to draw themselves closer to God. Luther's development of the large and small catechism was a way for fathers to use it to teach at their tables, for their learning to happen in the family setting. Back in the early days of Lutheranism, Christian education happened at the home, at the table. This is where the family found God, and this was a tradition we share with our Jewish siblings. Right now, we are exiled much like Israel was exiled in Egypt. We have been asked to distance ourselves not only from our neighbors, but also from our places of worship. But that does not mean that worship has ceased. Worship can still occur. We can still draw close to God. And we do that around the holiness of our dinner tables. Our world is changing, and that can be an exciting time for us to make some changes in our own home and our own families as well. Perhaps during this time of togetherness, you start a new tradition in your home. 1 or 2 meals a week together as a family. For some of our families, that can be difficult due to scheduling. Perhaps, maybe you set aside 1 meal a week where you get dressed up and just enjoy each other's company. But more importantly, perhaps you set aside 1 meal a week as a time to read scripture together, pray, and to seek God. Israel made the most of their meal together on that Passover night. In fact, they made such a tradition of it that it continues to this day, thousands of years later. In homes all over our area, our Jewish siblings tonight will be asking the question, why is this night different from all other nights? And we as Christians can ask the same question. The Holy Passover is a tradition we share with our Jewish siblings in a very intimate way. The tradition of gathering in our homes around the table is a tradition that we can still share with them. May your table be a place of learning. May it be a place of togetherness, and may it be a place of worship. May God bless you at this time and always. And to our Jewish siblings, Chag Sameach, a blessed Passover to you all.